Shabbos Daf Lamed Vav concludes the second parak of Masechta Shabbos. About halfway through, we will conclude the parak with a discussion about muktzah. We will see a contradiction between three brises as to whether a shofar and a trumpet are muktzah items. Then the Gemara will have 5 examples of things whose names changed after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and the Gemara will provide explanations for why the name change is a halachically significant thing. So at the end of the daf, which we learned yesterday, Daf Lamed Hey, the Gemara was discussing a shofar and a trumpet. And the Gemara quoted 2 brises there, and now we'll have a third one, that all have conflicting discussions as to whether they are muktzah or not. One of them says that both a shofar and a trumpet are muktzah on Shabbos. One of them says that neither of them are muktzah on Shabbos. And the third one says that only the trumpet is muktzah, but the shofar is not. Now, shofar is generally what we define as the tool we use to blow on Rosh Hashanah. It's a ram's horn, and it's curved. The reason why that wouldn't be muktzah is because it has a possible use on Shabbos. You can use it to scoop up water and then give it to a child to drink through the narrow end of it, like a bottle. Trumpets, though, are straight. They're smooth and straight, and they do not have any curve and can't be used to scoop anything. So it's more likely that a trumpet is muktzah than a shofar. Again, we're understanding that muktzah works that if an object has a function on Shabbos, then it's not going to be muktzah. As we shall see, that is a discussion later. So as far as explaining why one brisa says that a shofar is muktzah, one brisa says that it is not muktzah, the Gemara has Rav Yosef's explanation. He says because one is talking about a shofar which belongs to a private individual. He could use that to feed his child. However, a shofar which belongs to the community, like the one which was used to blow on Erev Shabbos to announce the arrival of Shabbos, that shofar you can't use to feed water to anybody because it doesn't belong to anybody. So therefore it has no function and therefore it's muktzah. So the Gemara says, Abaye says, first of all, that's not true because a public shofar could be used to feed water to a poor child who's an orphan, and therefore his responsibility is upon the entire congregation to feed him. Second of all, you didn't answer the contradiction as far as to whether a trumpet is muktzah or not. So therefore, Abaye proposes a different answer, and Abaye says that the 3 different brises are really 3 different Tanoim. One is Reb Shimon, one is Reb Yehuda, and one is Reb Nechemia. Now, there are 3 opinions work as follows. Reb Yehuda holds that the definition of muktzah is, as we said, an object which is defined as an object whose specified use is for forbidden function on Shabbos, such as a hammer for knocking nails or a shofar for blowing. These are not permitted uses on Shabbos. However, they can have other obvious uses that are permitted, such as using a hammer to crack a nut and using a shofar to scoop water. So a situation like that, it's not muktzah. However, a trumpet, which has no apparent use, you can't really use it for anything, that is muktzah. It has only one defined use, and that use is not permitted on Shabbos. Therefore, the brisa which says that trumpets are muktzah and shofars are not is Rav Yehuda. Now, Reb Shimon's opinion is that any object, even if it has no apparent use which is permitted on Shabbos, as long as it's a functional object, it's not muktzah under certain circumstances. You can use it to move it, to put it away. You can use it if you do think of a function that it's useful for. He says that an object doesn't have to have a function which is permitted on Shabbos. It has to have a function at all. Therefore, he says that trumpets and shofaros are not muktzah at all. Under certain circumstances, you're allowed to move the trumpet, even though it has nothing that you can really do with it on Shabbos, but if you can find something to do with it, or if you need to move it out of the way, then you're allowed to move it, and therefore he is the author of the brisa that says that neither are really muktzah. Now, the other one, the one that says that both are muktzah, that's Rav Nechemia. Rav Nechemia's opinion is that you can only use an object for its specific defined function. You cannot use it for any other function. You can't use a knife to cut anything other than food, because the function of a knife is to cut food. Therefore, he would say that even the shofar is muktzah. You cannot use a shofar for anything other than blowing, and blowing is forbidden on Shabbos. Therefore, the shofar is completely muktzah, and he's the author of the brisa that says that shofars and trumpets are both muktzah. The Gemara now asks on Rav Nechemia's brisa, which says that both a shofar and a trumpet are muktzah. Why does it say it in that order? It doesn't make sense. If a shofar is muktzah, a trumpet is for sure muktzah. A trumpet is less functional on Shabbos than a shofar is. So Gemara says the reason why it says it that way is because this is one of three things that Rav Chisda mentions whose names switched at the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. The word shofar used to refer to a actual shofar. Now, in the popular lexicon, what people call it, it's called a chatzotzra. And what we now call a shofar used to be called a chatzotzra. The two switched. The words chatzotzra, trumpet, and shofar switched in their meanings. This is important because if you're talking to a man of the street in the days of Chazal, you should know that what he has to blow on Rosh Hashanah, he calls a chatzotzra. It's not what we call a shofar today. We call a shofar today what people used to call a shofar in the times of the Beis Hamikdash. Now, the Gemara continues the list of things whose names switch. The Gemara says an arava and a tzaftzava switched. Arava is kosher for use in a lulav. That is now what people call a tzaftzava. So if you're going to speak to an Amoritz, you have to use the term tzaftzava. Now, tzaftzava, which is called by the Amaratzim, what is called an arava, is a plant which is different than what we call an arava today in the sense that its leaves are more rounded and its stem is white, as opposed to our aravas that are elongated and have a red stem. Now the third thing whose name switched is a pesora and a pesorta. These are two types of tables. Pesora used to be called a small table. The pesora used to be the name for a small table, and pesorta is now the name for a small table. And this is important to know because if you go into a contract to sell somebody a pesora or pesorta, you have to know which table you should deliver to him. Now the Gemara adds two more things from other Manda Amrim that names also changed. Abaye says a havlila and a beikoisoi changed. These refer to the second and third stomachs of a ruminant animal, a kosher animal, which chews its cud. As you may know, kosher animals have four parts to their digestive organs. The first one is called the rumen, it grinds up the food. The second is called the reticulum. That is what is generally called the beis hakosos because its lining is shaped like a number of cups that are together. The third one is called the omesum. That's the hempsis, which has a very ridged, spiky lining. And the last one we call the abomesum is called the keva. Now, the hempsis and the beis hakosos, their names have switched. One used to be called havlila, and now it's called beikasi, and it used to be the opposite. Why is that important? It's important because there's a halacha that is different between the two, because one of them has a very thick wall, one has a thin wall. So if you find a needle that is planted in the wall of the reticulum, which has the thicker lining, so as long as it doesn't go through and through, it's not treif, because the hole doesn't go through from one organ to the other. However, if you find it in the wall of the omesum, the third stomach, then it's a bigger problem, because the wall there is very thin. So even if the needle doesn't stick all the way through, you can assume that the hole goes all the way through, and it would be treif. So you have to know which one is the beikasi and which one is the havlila. And then the last example of things whose name changed are the towns of Bavel and Bursif. Bursif is a town near the place that we call Babylonia. The two used to have inverted names, and now their names have been changed in the language of the populace. And this is important because if you're going to write a get, you have to write the town that the people who are identified in the get lived in. You have to make sure to get the name correct. This takes us to the end of Perek Bameh Madlikin, and now we start Perek Kira. The third chapter of Masechta Shabbos, Perek Kira, deals in its first part with the halachos of having food on the fire or on the stove over Shabbos. Now, we're going to discuss two potential rabbinical prohibitions here, Isurei Derabanan. Usually there's no Isur Deraisa because the food is cooked, and placing cooked food or having cooked food on the fire over Shabbos will not do any more cooking midaraisa. However, the two Isurei Derabanan are, one is called Shehiyah, which is called leaving food on the fire over Shabbos, and the potential concern there was that people may stoke the coals under the food, under the pot of food, in order to get it to heat faster or more intensely. And the second Isser is called Chazara, which means placing the pot of food, although it's cooked already, placing the pot of food on the fire. Now, this includes Shehiyah. If you're going to place it on the food, it'll be left on the fire afterwards. So that would also include all the Isurim and all the potential concerns of Shehiyah. There's the concern of stoking the coals exists, there's also an additional concern that when you're putting food on the fire, even if it's fully cooked, people who are seeing or watching do not understand that it's fully cooked, and it looks like you're cooking uncooked food, and therefore it may become common that people will permit such actions. So these are the two concerns. Again, leaving food on the fire, shehiyah, because of stoking the coals, and placing food on the fire besides for the concern of stoking the coals, there's an additional concern of what's called the mechzik and mevashel. It appears like you are cooking. So the Mishnah begins with one statement and then two machloks in between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. And the Gemara will try to ascertain what exactly the case of the Mishnah is. So first of all, the Mishnah talks about having food on the fire. So it says you have food on the stove. The term that's used is kira. Now, a kira in the days of Chazal was shaped like a pot itself, was a clay structure shaped like a pot with a wood fire or some other type of a fire burning in the bottom of it, and then on the top of it you could put a pot so that the fire was under the pot like the stoves which we have today. Now, kira, which is what the Mishnah quotes, actually has room for two pots. It's a rectangular structure, has room for two pots, and therefore its heat is somewhat less than a one-pot stove, which has a different name and that's more intense. Now, our modern stoves and ovens have levels of heat similar to that of a kira, so this is the most relevant to us. So, the Mishnah discusses kira, and it says that whether or not you're allowed to leave food on it depends on what the fuel that was used to burn it was. So if you use a fuel that doesn't get very hot, like straw or other remnants of wheat stalks, it's not really such a problem. Once the fire has gone out, there's not much left by the way of coals there, and therefore those coals aren't too hot, and there's no issue. We're going to focus on if it burned other types of fuels which do leave coals, such as wood, which leaves coals behind, or the remnants of pressed sesames or olives. Those things leave good heat-producing sources afterwards. So, if your stove burned any of these fuels, even after the fire has gone out, there are coals left behind, and we're concerned that if you have a pot on the fire on Shabbos, you may stoke the coals. So, therefore, the only way that it's permitted is if you have something which reduces the heat. So there are two structures you can use. You can either cover the coals with ashes. The dead ashes will reduce the heat, and that makes it clear that you aren't going to stoke the coals anymore because you're not concerned about the heat. The other thing you can do is scoop out all or most of the coals, and then even what's left you won't stoke because you've reduced the heat. So that's how you can leave food on the fire over Shabbos. Now, the Mishnah's language did not specify if we're talking about leaving food on the fire or placing food on the fire. The Gemara will try to figure out which of the two it's referring to. But we do have two machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai over here. The first machlokas is what type of food are we talking about when we say you could have it on the fire if you cover or remove the coals. So Beis Shammai says it's only water, because water doesn't really cook, it just gets hot and people aren't too concerned about it. There's less concern that they'll come to stoke the coals. However, a pot of food that you can't, people will stoke the coals, we're concerned about that anyway. Beis Hillel says no, even a pot of food is okay if you covered or shoveled out most or all of the coals. That's the first machlokas. The second machlokas in the Mishnah is, what are we talking about here? Beis Shammai says you're only allowed to take something off the stove in this situation. Beis Hillel says you're even allowed to place it on the stove in this situation. The Gemara now wants to know, this Mishnah, when it's saying that you have to clear the coals or cover them, is that talking about in order to place food on the fire, to do chazara? Or is it talking about both placing food and leaving food on the fire? What's the issue? We saw earlier, a few daf ago, the opinion of Hanania that says that as long as food is cooked to the point where it's possibly edible by somebody somewhere, which is 1/3 cooked, which is usually the case, there's no problem of leaving food on the fire at all. You don't have to clear coals, you don't have to cover coals, there's no issue involved. So if this Mishnah is agreeing with Hanania, then it can't be talking about leaving food on the fire. It must be talking only about placing food on the fire. And on that it says you have to cover the coals or you have to clear the coals. The other hand, it is possible that this Mishnah does not agree with Hanania. And it says, no, leaving food on the fire also has a problem of shehiyah. It's also a problem even if it is partially cooked, even if it is edible, and therefore you have to clear it and cover it in that case as well. So again, our question is, when the Mishnah discusses that you have to clear and cover the coals, is it saying in order to place food on the fire on Shabbos, but if you left it there from before Shabbos, there's no problem. There's no issue. Or it's talking about both placing and leaving food on the fire. So right away, the Gemara says, how could you have such a question? Look at the Mishnah. We have two machlokes in Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. The last machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai is about, are you allowed to place food on the fire? Now, if that's what we've been talking about all along, and the first machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai as to whether it was talking about water or cooked food, so how can you have that machlokes again? It's just a repetition of the same machlokes. It must be that the first part of the Mishnah was talking about leaving food on the fire. On that base, Shammai said you only allowed to leave cooked water, you're not allowed to leave cooked food. And then you have the last machlokes in the Mishnah was, are you allowed to place food? And on that base, Shammai says no, you're not allowed to place food or water at all. So otherwise, if you're going to tell me that the Mishnah is only talking about Chazara all along, this last machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, which says, are we talking about Chazara or not? Is Chazara permitted or not? Doesn't make sense. So the Gemara says, no, maybe you really read the Mishnah that the first machlokes was about the implication of what we were talking about, meaning as follows. We're talking about placing food on the fire all along. And the Mishnah starts off and it tells you you're not allowed to place food on the fire unless you clear it and unless you cover it. But we really agree with Hanania that leaving food on the fire is permitted. And on that, the Gemara quotes Beis Shammai, and Beis Shammai says, oh, this that we're implying that leaving food is permitted, like Hanania, that's only talking about water, not referring to pots of food. And then I have the end of the Mishnah that says, by the way, you remember the first thing which we discussed? I said that in order to place food on the fire, you have to clear it or cover it. That's also only according to Beis Hillel, but Beis Shammai say that you're not allowed to place food on the fire under any circumstance. Meaning, the Gemara's proof attempted to say that the Mishnah had to be talking about leaving food on the fire because otherwise you couldn't have two machlokes in Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. And the Gemara's answer is no. It's talking about placing food on the fire all along, but the implication is that leaving food on the fire is okay. And on that, we had the first machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about the implication, and the second machlokes is about what it actually says, that placing food on the fire is okay as long as you clear the coals and cover them, or cover them.